So what we are seeing across the continent of Europe, which has already received a huge migration from the Middle East and North Africa, and which will receive more, is an ever-rising level of social disharmony verging on violence. 2015, which is the year of the Great Migration from Syria, was also the year in which anti-Semitic hate crimes reached an unprecedented level in Great Britain. It was the year in which crimes of violence against both Jews and gays reached an unprecedented level in France. It was the year of the mass organized sex attacks in the city of Germany, not just Cologne, but other cities as well. It was the year in which we have seen riots and anti-Semitic incidents in Swedish cities like Malmo. I don't want to be, I look at this not as a way of pointing fingers or saying there are groups of people who are somehow intrinsically bad. People are people. But the journey from a country that is rural, that is not very literate, where skill levels are low, and where you are imbued from the moment you're born with a conviction that women have a certain place, that religious views are privileged, and that violence and success in violence is the test of a man. That the journey from that place to another place is an extraordinary, difficult journey to make, and the half fragments of this that your children are raised with create a situation where Europe is now inheriting, and where Canada will, if you accept this resolution, will find itself also inheriting a degree of social turmoil and violence unheard of since the Second World War. 7,000 Jews have emigrated from France in the past 2 years. As a response to anti-Semitic violence. That the price of the in-migration of these large Middle Eastern communities has been the out-migration of the remnants of the European Jewish community. I've heard senior people in the German government say we have to do this because of our debt to our own history. And I ask them, how do you repay your debt to history by driving into exile Europe's last Jews? Because that is one of the consequences of the gigantic demographic change that we are seeing. There are responses to this tremendous humanitarian crisis that are responsible and that are affordable. You can produce, and this is why I want to direct your attention again to that figure of 12 times the cost to bring people to North America as to take care for them in region. As Elizabeth May so rightly said at the beginning of her remarks, the best solution is for people to return to their homes. Now, there's a political process as to how we make that possible. How do you bring peace to Syria? That is outside the terms of tonight's debate. But on the borders of Syria, and inside, by the way, when we talk about Lebanon and Turkey, it is important to recognize that these are territories that within living memory were one political entity with Syria. Lebanon was part of Syria before the Second World War. Syria was part of Turkey before the First World War. These are not catastrophically traumatic migrations for people to make. It should be possible to bring them running water. It should be possible to bring them electricity. It should be possible to bring work to people where it is needed. It should be possible to bring education in languages that people already know to the places where people already live. It is a big mistake to think of Syrian refugees as living in acres and acres of tents, although we have seen that image. Most of them now live in the cities of Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, and they need help. And ironically, at exactly the same moment, when we are experiencing this giant mass migration from Syria into Europe and, if we don't choose correctly, into North America, at exactly that moment, all of the agencies that provide services in country to many more people than will ever migrate are starved of funds and are reporting constant shortages and are finding that they cannot raise the money, not from the Persian Gulf, but also not from the countries of Europe, who are overwhelmed with the social problems they are experiencing as a result of the migration they've already received, never mind the bigger migration that could be in store if we follow this resolution. That the bulk, the vast majority of the Syrian population in area in need is being neglected worse than if we had a responsible, concentrated focus on the problem where it is found and where it must be dealt with. Elizabeth May herself agreed we can't move millions of people. But the problem is denominated in the millions of people. And if you have a problem denominated in millions of people, and you say, well, my solution won't work for millions of people, it's not a good solution. The solution must be proportionate to the problem. Migration to the West, migration to Canada is not a solution proportionate to this problem. And precisely because you are the kind of people whom Elizabeth May so rightly praised as compassionate, people with a vision of the future, but also because you want your compassion to be used in ways that do not just gratify the impulse of the moment, but that actually lead to long-term benefit. you are going to, I hope, agree that the answer to this question is no. The right solution to the Syrian crisis is generous, responsible provision of water, electricity, education, job opportunities in the place where the refugees are and where most of them inevitably must stay. That's my proposal to you tonight. And the doors will be open. You can leave if you want to after the event. Thank you very much.
Frum, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, sir, for rebuttal.
I agree with Elizabeth May that the problem of anti-Semitic violence in France is not, by the way, 600 violent incidents a year, including in 2015 the massacre at the kosher market, very large-scale violence. This is not graffiti, not chalk marks on it. I agree with her that that is not a work of the people who arrived in the present flow of migration. It's a work of the people who arrived, who are the children of the people who arrived in the Algerian migration of the 1990s. In the 1990s, there was a terrible civil war in Algeria. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and many of them arrived in France. And their children, who grew up having the difficulty of transition, their children are the people who are committing these crimes, not just against Jews, but also against gays. Again, 2015 was the record year for anti-gay violence in France. In the same way, in Sweden, where we are seeing very high levels of violence against women and against gays, they took on a large Kurdish population in the 1990s, and it is the children of that Kurdish population. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't wonderful people, and that isn't to say that everybody does this thing. In fact, it is always the work of a minority. But understand that this problem of the problem of acculturation is way more difficult than proponents of an easy solution will acknowledge. And when you make the population big enough, if the problem of acculturation affects a fifth of that group, if you're talking about 10,000 people and you've got a fifth of them are people who have trouble with the law, who are delinquency, who take out their anger against women or gays or Jews, police forces can cope with that. As we saw in Brussels right now, that the police force of Belgium simply cannot keep track of all of the suspects they have. The entire Belgian police force is now tracking radicalized suspects in Brussels. Again, these are children of people who arrived in the 1990s, and they're overwhelmed. You make the denominator big enough, and even if the fraction's fairly small, the numerator becomes impossible to cope with. And that is why mass resettlement. Now, if the question is, can Canada take 10,000 carefully screened people, particularly from groups like the Yazidis, from the Christians, from gays and lesbians, I say, if that's what the proposal is, I don't think anybody would have a problem with that. That is not mass resettlement, that is selected resettlement. If we are choosing people who themselves have experienced persecution for things they have done, then that is something we can well cope with. Mass resettlement is resettlement proportionate to the mass disaster we face. And that, I think we are reaching agreement here. That, I think we both agree, is impossible. And it may be that we're going to be unanimous at the end of this evening, that no one here thinks that mass resettlement of Syrians in the West or in Canada can possibly work. It won't help the Syrians because there are too many, and it will be dangerous for Canada. There's a Yiddish saying, for instance isn't proof. And I am not here, I watched the Monk debate in Toronto that dealt with some of the same issues. And I have to say, I wasn't pleased with it. I don't think that we get anywhere by looking at a population of millions of people and citing one bad actor and comparing him or her to one good actor, because with millions of people, there are a lot. I think you have to think globally. And you have to recognize, and you have to say, will people who may not even start off as bad actors, what happens when you bring them into an environment where they can't succeed? Where you bring them into an environment that challenges their core beliefs about the hierarchy of the sexes, they have a belief about that challenges their core beliefs about the hierarchy of religions, and that asks them that insists they work and requires of them skills they do not have and are not going to develop. Syria is not a country of well-educated people. Remember, it's a country of basically 1/5 of the population, agricultural laborers. Before the Civil War, 6 years of education, and education that is not very relevant to the demands they are going to meet in Canada. This is not going to work. It's not going to be a success. It's not doing anybody a favor, and it is going to cost 12 times as much per person as providing electricity and water and jobs in sight, which is where most of them must remain anyway, and where right now the funds are most desperately short. So I urge you, I don't want to ask you to say no. I want to ask you to say yes to adequately funding through international organizations, adequately funding the resettlement of Syrians where they are and providing adequate levels of support, material support, job opportunities where they are. That is the thing to say yes to. And the proposition tonight is a terrible distraction. And as Elizabeth May and I think agree, an unworkable distraction from the real solution to the real problem. Thank you very much.
Yours, sir?
Let me start with the last question that was directed to me. I began my remarks by saying I don't think we should make policy on the basis of sad images of a body on the beach. I also don't think we should make policy on the basis of horrifying images of crimes. I think we have to think about this in how it's going to be true for large numbers of people. Although I think it is dangerous, I would agree with the answer that Mark Stein and Nigel Farage had, that the answer is no. I don't agree with the method of pointing to individual shocking incidents as proving anything. Individual incidents, we're talking about populations of millions, don't prove much. Whether they're the sad incidents, and for every horrifying story that Stein and Farage could cite, there was a heartbreaking story that somebody else could cite. And what you end up then is with exactly the kind of thing that I began the evening by saying I think gets in the way, which is you get a battle of dueling emotions and dueling images when we need to think for the future and think for the next generation about how you build this country. This country's interests, I believe, are in saying no. I don't think they got the answer wrong, but I think that they went about it in a way that is just going to be met with more sad images. For every horror story, a sad image. Now let me answer the question about the comment about the oil. No, I do not believe that the West made this problem. The cause of this problem, I am convinced, is the ecological crisis. I think global warming or climate change does have a lot to do with it. But it's not just because of the oil. Egypt, which has no oil, 17 million people at the end of World War II, 40 million people when Anwar Sadat was assassinated, 80 million people when Hosni Mubarak was driven from office, something over 90 million people now, the single largest group of the population under 25, no work for them, no possibility of marriage for them, and the result is ever rising levels of violence, which are met with ever heavier levels of repression from the Egyptian state. How long is that going to last before Egypt cracks? And there are millions of Egyptians seeking entry into Europe. I don't know the answer to that question. Those are the kinds of problems that we are confronted, that you've got a region that is in a Malthusian crisis, and it needs a solution, but the mass migration of that population into Europe will only, and into North America, will only impose that same crisis on other countries, not solve that crisis in region. It is going, and it will change the receiving countries. Migration, it is true that we have low population rates of growth in the West, and that's a big problem. But that is what makes immigration more troublesome, not less. I often say that migration is to natural population increase as wine is to food. A good complement, a bad substitute.
Okay.
Three very rich and those are three very rich and sophisticated questions, and I won't be able to do justice to them. But let me take 2 points that I think it is important to make. The first is to go to this point about screening. It is important for people to understand it simply cannot be done. It doesn't happen. Because what are you using as your database to screen against? How do you know when you're presented with the document from someone who's come from a war zone where the state is shattered? And where the state, to the extent the state functions, the state is an incredibly sinister and totalitarian organization that lies about people all the time. How do you check the document? It can't be checked.